The Learn at Lunch seminars will feature a series of experts in their fields who will speak on various topics impacting Christians in the Middle East. Today's Learn at Lunch seminar will focus specifically on Christians and other religious minorities in Iraq, specifically in the wake of ISIS, and examine some of the current issues that face these communities in their native homeland. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and invite William Roberts to get us started and introduce today's speaker. William.
Good afternoon, and thank you for attending the first IDC Learn at Lunch seminar. I'm William Roberts, Government Relations Associate with IDC. This is the first in IDC's Learn at Lunch series designed to explore and educate on international religious freedom issues and issues affecting Christians in the Middle East and around the world. Today, we'll be discussing the ongoing challenges facing Christians and other religious minorities in Iraq. Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization and has been home to richly diverse ethnic and religious communities throughout history. Christianity has an ancient presence in Iraq, with some of the oldest Christian denominations having sown their seeds there 2,000 years ago. To this day, they celebrate their religious rites in the Aramaic language, but today, these communities face an existential threat. Prior to 2003, approximately 1.5 million Christians lived in Iraq. Today, less than 150,000 remain. This represents a demographic decline of over 90% in 2 decades. Religious minorities targeted by ISIS remain internally displaced, with many more abroad, seeing no hope in returning to a country where they at best cannot prosper and at worst are under threat of renewed genocide. Christians and other religious minorities in Iraq continue to come under attack by the remnants of ISIS, as well as often being caught in the crossfire of Iranian proxy forces, Turkish military operations, and Kurdish forces. Without a plan in action to protect minority communities, demographic trends will continue until Christians and other religious minorities are extinct from Iraq. We're honored to have Dr. Elie Abouaoun to join us today to discuss the ongoing challenges facing Christians and other religious minorities in Iraq and the means to address the problem set. Dr. Elie Abouaoun is the director of the U.S. Institute of Peace North Africa Programs and of the Middle East and North Africa Regional Hub. Dr. Abouaoun previously served as the executive director of the Arab Human Rights Fund and as acting country director and program manager of the Danish Refugee Council in Iraq. Dr. Abouaoun's dedication to improve the humanitarian, human rights, and development conditions of the region is further illustrated by his role in developing the Council of Europe's Human Rights Education Manual and his positions on the boards of universities and other regional organizations and fellowships with the Center for International Strategic Studies and the Religion and Security Council. We look forward to hearing your insights. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Abouaoun. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, William. I would like to thank IDC for inviting me to be the first speaker in this series. I'm really honored by this. So as you rightly said, I'm affiliated with the U.S. Institute of Peace, but I want to clarify that what I will say today does not necessarily reflect the opinion of the Institute. These are essentially my personal insights about the issue. Obviously, the issue of minorities in the MENA region, including in Iraq, is very complex. It's almost impossible to capture all its nuances in less than an hour. But I will try my best at least to trigger a discussion about 3 main questions. So the first one is, in the first place, why is there an issue of minorities in Iraq? And the second question is, what are the perceptions and the realities of religious minorities and other majority groups in Iraq? And the third one is more practical, which is what can be done going forward. So on the first question, I'd like to start by something that happened to me last week. Last week, I was in Venice in Italy with the family. We're on a family vacation. And the touristic guide who was showing us the city, who was a PhD in anthropology, told us something quite indicative. He said during the conversation, "We are Italians outside of Italy. Inside the country, we are Romans, Sicilians, Venetians, Toscanis, etc." So this is to say that the issue of subnational identities is neither exclusive to Iraq nor to the MENA region, as some like to think. Radical and in some cases less radical Islamists actually attributed to diversity a host of issues like Western interference, lack of stability, undermining Islam, etc. Most importantly, the so-called secular dictators, leftist intellectuals, and activists in the region have embraced a similar approach and considered that building one national identity is mutually exclusive with preserving other identities, religious, ethnic, tribal, etc. Both religious and secular regimes in the region took measures to undermine the subnational identities, including religious identities, obviously. And this attack on religious identities happened in the aftermath of the First World War. And as the new states, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Jordan, were emerging. But it also happened after centuries of Ottoman rule, during which these same subnational identities were instrumentalized by the Ottomans to divide and conquer. The Ottoman millet system established courts under which religious minorities were allowed to govern themselves for many internal issues. And this system involved the creation of bodies with authority to legislate over specific political, cultural, or social matters, while territorial provinces retained governing powers over broader economic and regulatory affairs. The result of this policy was that an individual would feel that their affiliation with a specific religious group entitled them to certain privileges and calls for protection from the elite of this group. So one can imagine coming out from a system like this to straightforward, without any transition, to a European-inspired nation-state model at the beginning of the 20th century, where you had to forego all your safeguards and where your religious or ethnic identity was under threat. Obviously, this would trigger a lot of defense, hostile and defensive actions. Even after that, what followed was not better. I mean, we've seen the emergence almost simultaneously of discriminatory religious doctrines like the Muslim Brotherhood, or later on branded as political Islam, and the dictatorial secular theories, the Ba'ath, Pan-Arabism, etc. We've seen also a very high political and emotional polarization and a very high anti-Western sentiment resulting from the conflict between several MENA countries and the State of Israel after its proclamation in 1948. We've seen the Cold War doctrine, which overlooked the human rights and diversity management records of certain regimes, as long as they kept their countries away from the Soviets. We've seen the Iranian Revolution happening, the emergence of Wahhabism and the use of jihadism, Hamas, the mullahs in Iran, Mujahideen, etc., by the West, as useful proxies to counter the Soviet Union. And then later on, we've seen the 9/11 and its aftermath in the region, followed by the 2011 uprising and the disasters these failed revolutions brought to the population in the region. So this is all to summarize the political aspect of the issue, but there's also a social dimension that is often overlooked. As a matter of fact, in the region, violence is generally accepted as a normal way of achieving political interest, and exclusion is an entrenched attitude across the region. Ironically enough, even among the same minority groups who complain about being excluded by the demographic majority. Moving on to the second aspect. So what are the perceptions and realities of religious minorities and other majority groups in the region? In 2010, an assessment of Christians in Iraq that was done in Mosul, Erbil, Soleimani, and Duhok revealed that the three top priorities are services, 68%, jobs, 42%, and security, 34%. Data collected by USIP between 2019 and 2021 among religious minorities in Nineveh province, as part of the Institute's flagship project called Conflict Stabilization and Monitoring Framework, showed the same priorities, but in a different ranking. So it showed security coming first, jobs second, and services in the third rank. The increasing anxiety about security is very likely due to the multiplicity of security actors after the liberation from ISIS who were involved in the province. Most importantly, the non-state actors, including the remnants of jihadist groups in some locations, but most importantly, the PMF unit, the Popular Mobilization Forces units, especially those who are supported by Iran. What is adding to the anxiety is the pervasive role some of these non-state actors are playing in local governance and civilian affairs in general. On top of the security issues, religious minorities are also captured by another vicious circle. So the lack of trust in security actors is compounded by lack of economic opportunities and gloomy prospects of upward social mobility, as well as a complete lack of trust not only in political actors, but most importantly, in political processes. And when people don't see any possibility for change, they are in a mood to leave. They decide to leave. But in order to leave, you need money. And the easiest way to get money is to sell your properties. So while your own demographics are on the decline, the buyers would naturally be from other communities. With too many families settling in a new place from another community, then the cultural identity of your own place would be altered, leading more indigenous families to leave. And it goes on and on. So this is the cycle. People need money, they sell their property, the cultural identity changes, more people are leaving, etc., etc. So these communities, the religious minorities in Iraq, feel that the space is closing on them, their identity is threatened, and that there are no economic or social prospects. Obviously, this is not new. This is as old as is the age of the Republic of Iraq. Then this is to exclude the Ottoman period, of course. So in 1932, Assyrians and Yazidis petitioned for international protection because they had the same anxieties. In 1941, we've seen how state institutions took too long, several days, to respond to assaults on Iraqi Jews. It caused 200 deaths and a lot of property destroyed. In 1948, the movement of Jews were restricted. They were barred from certain governmental posts, courts-martialed, imprisoned, and intimidated. So in general, what I'm trying to say here is that the aggressions targeting religious minorities did not start in 2003, as some people like to say. They are older, much older than this, and the problem is much more deep-rooted than, the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq or whatever some analysts try to put forward. They reflect a long-standing negative perception by demographic majority groups. Here I'd like to quote Max van der Stoel. So Max van der Stoel served from 1993 to 2000 as the first High Commissioner of National Minorities at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. And what he wrote in one of his reports, that the process of creating nation states, so here I'm quoting him, the process of creating nation states with sizable minority communities is generally divisive and almost always destabilizing. On one hand, majorities will not go quietly in the face of separatism. On the other hand, minorities will not forever tolerate a situation where their subnational identities are considered second-rate, end of quote. Now, moving on to the third question, as I said, the most practical one. So what can be done going forward to prevent this demographic decline? I would like to start here by stating some of the things that must not be even considered based on the mistakes of the past. The first one is demonizing diversity and alienating subnational identities. This will only exacerbate the fears and lead to more radicalism among minority groups. The second one is we should avoid insisting on Western-inspired secular nation-state models, because this ill-adapted model requires the fusion of several constituents or identities into one, and this obviously will trigger more resistance. The third one is, we need to avoid imposing through the so-known secular Ba'athist tactics, a moral pressure on minority groups to reject their identities and just embrace one national identity. We need to avoid simplifying or oversimplifying the problem to a technical one by saying, okay, we change electoral laws, we change political systems to address, because this does not address the anxiety and the dissatisfaction and the legitimate fears of these communities. And the worst thing from my perspective is to promote this concept of equal citizenship, because equality in this case means that the majority groups will co-opt the minority groups. So what is needed here is a different framework that is based on equity and not equality, and equity that can be achieved through an inclusive citizenship, not the Western nation state model, as I said before. And this is how Iraq can actually accommodate its vast diversity. Identity itself must be redefined and used to reinforce rather than undermine state-building efforts. So this takes me back to what I said before about demonizing subnational identities. So the national and subnational identities should be perceived as complementary rather than mutually exclusive, and fears and anxieties can only be addressed through the following suggestions that I look forward to discussing with the rest of the audience after the presentation. So the first one is to look into potential constitutional guarantees. Reconstruction efforts are not sufficient for the return of displaced ethnic or religious minority populations. What is needed in parallel is a set of constitutional guarantees that will protect these groups and make sure that they are represented and not dominated by majority groups. In other words, we can call it power sharing. Now, power sharing in the region is not perceived positively. Actually, there is a wrong perception that power sharing is an anti-democratic practice. However, you know, if one looks into what's happening in other countries, we can see that several countries incorporated constitutional guarantees to protect or reassure some of their constituents, and this did not impede their democratic practices. Canada, Romania, Switzerland, etc. Some people like to attribute the lack of democracy, rampant corruption, and inefficient bureaucracy to the power sharing systems, and this is particularly applicable to the cases of Iraq and Lebanon. And I say with confidence that this is another misconstrued argument. Many countries adopted constitutional guarantees and are perfectly complying with the principles of democracy, as I said before. And corruption in general is beyond political, and especially in the region. There's no doubt that the current political systems in Iraq and in Lebanon to a certain level encourage the lack of accountability, impunity, but the social dimension of corruption shields it against any type of political system, even a secular one. So the question here is, if we have a secular system, would we have corruption or not? And I think looking at other MENA countries that never embraced power sharing systems, such as Syria, Egypt, Algeria, etc., we can see that the levels of corruption are very high over there. So the attributing corruption to the power sharing system, as I said, is a misconstrued argument. Even in Iraq itself, we've seen consistent levels of corruption that permeated all of the political regimes since the establishment of the republic, from the monarchy to post-2003, going through the dictatorship period. Another pitfall attributed to power sharing models is the absence of merit-based public and political appointments, what they call muhasasa in Arabic, or the quota shares. In Iraq and in many other MENA countries, senior civil servants are appointed based primarily on religious and or regional affiliations, which supersede merit, and that's a fact. Subnational groups regard having their people in senior government positions as an element of their political representation, and even more as a life insurance policy. So removing this guarantee is a problem. Now we need to reform it, we need to revisit it, yes, but we cannot remove it because, as I said, this is perceived as part of the political representation. So I'd like to move on to suggest another concept, which is the non-territorial autonomy. You know, and this usually non-territorial autonomy is something that can accommodate and protect diversity. So the concept was put forth by Karl Cordell, who is a professor of politics at Plymouth University and co-editor of the Journal of Ethnopolitics. And the model advocates the creation of minority rights regimes in societies that are culturally diverse, but which, for a variety of reasons, are not wholly suited for conventional federal solutions. Non-territorial autonomy allows for minority groups that are geographically distant but culturally bound to advocate for their own cultural, social, linguistic, educational, and political interests by giving them the rights to formally organize themselves in associations and other platforms in which every region, in every region they dwell in. And elements of non-territorial autonomy have been adopted in Belgium, Hungary, and some Scandinavian countries. So this is something that could be considered for Iraq. I'm not saying it will work, definitely. I'm saying it can work in Iraq. The third element is the effective, inclusive, and transparent local governments. In Iraq and in the region in general, this is the most cited demand by people. They just want effective, local, inclusive government and transparent local government. This is the ambition of the people. People are tired of discussing national politics. They just want to see a model of proximity governance that is effective, inclusive, and transparent, as I said. Now, inclusivity means participation. constitutional and legislative amendments should be encouraged to mainstream more participation at the local level, local governance structures. And USIP's, our own institute, experience in participatory budgeting in northern Iraq more specifically is quite indicative about how much this approach can be successful. Obviously, we also need to think about mainstreaming more transparency into local governance structures by working on access to information, complaint mechanisms, accountability frameworks, etc. So governance, in a nutshell, governance has to be local and decentralized, as this conveys trust in the system, because citizens then would feel that they are empowered and that they can hold their elected or appointed officers accountable for their mistakes. Due to demographic changes resulting from mass displacement in recent years, the boundaries of administrative units should be remodeled in northern Iraq and in Iraq in general, but specifically northern Iraq, to better represent ethno-religious distributions among communities. More accurate representation in local councils, local security forces, and other elements of local government may better address identity-based fears and anxieties. Obviously, on top of all of this, two prerequisites for any governance model are the rule of law and independent judiciary. I think these should be pursued at the national level. Fourth element that I would like to suggest is to work on long-term social change among minority groups themselves. As I said, the problem is not only political, it has a social dimension. In Iraq and the rest of the region, obviously, exclusionary social practices by minority groups themselves make them fragile and conflict vulnerable. The monopolistic and non-inclusive governance style adopted by political organizations, including the same parties that represent minority groups and claim to be secular and democratic, is indicative of how political exclusion is the rule, not the exception. So the lack of inclusivity transcends political considerations and the public sector to shape corporate behavior and social norms. So it goes to the private sector and to the society at large. Examples are domestic violence, widespread discrimination against refugees, people of color, migrant workers, any other outsiders. So all these are examples of how problems wrongly attributed to sectarianism or power sharing are actually a social problem, not a political one. Fifth one is ensuring prospects of upward social mobility. So for a variety of reasons cited by families who are emigrating, these families feel that their economic might and demographics are being eroded over time. Demographic decline is irreversible, but economic empowerment is achievable in this case. Existing programs of economic growth and economic support focus on, so we have two models. We have some programs focusing on extremely vulnerable groups, like the charity approach, basically. And we have others which are somehow single-minded because they provide access to capital, small and medium enterprise, access to banking, etc., bolstering education institutions. But what they really miss is the social mobility aspect. An average middle-class household needs more than just an income to be incentivized to stay. They need to see prospects of social mobility, as I said. In other terms, they want to see how their overall quality of life will improve over time. This comes through a predictable increase in the household income. They need to predict how their income will increase. They need to ensure that they can provide top-notch education for their kids. They need to see the ability to achieve a social status in their community, the prospects of career growth, participation in public life, etc., etc. So on top of a regular income, we need a lot of other aspects to create incentives for people not to leave. Otherwise, short of this, one can create, you can create as many job opportunities as you want, people will still leave. The number six, sixth element that I'd like to suggest is how we can leverage our own resources and to stop relying on foreign assistance. We need to understand that the paradigms of the foreign policy of Western countries have changed significantly over the last years. Expecting massive support from the West to minority groups is unrealistic. Some activists and experts continue to fantasize about international UN protection, military interventions, military support to armed groups, protecting religious minorities, significant diplomatic pressures on governments, etc., etc. I think most of these are not achievable anymore, or if they are achievable, they are only achievable up to a certain extent. So we need to figure out ways of dealing with the other constituents, in this case of Iraq, through dialogue, alliances, trust building, and a new social contract. It is true that the current power dynamics don't allow a meaningful engagement between religious minorities and other groups because there's no balance in the relationship. There is an unbalanced power dynamics between these groups. So therefore, it's very important to instill or expand the strategic assets of religious minority groups. And one of them, and the most important one, is the property of land, the ownership of land. This has to be protected at any cost. And I've seen in my years of work in Iraq that this is not the case, unfortunately. So this can, I mean, there are many ways of achieving it. One way could be through the creation of endowment funds by well-established diaspora groups or high net worth individuals who would buy any real estate property from needy families and avoid a transfer of ownership to other majority groups. Relying on administrative arrangements to prevent this ownership transfer, as it is the case today, is risky. Today, people keep telling me that there is a decision by the Prime Minister to stop registering real estate transactions, etc. I think all of this is temporary and too risky to rely on. The more viable approach is to create a system by which any property listed for sale is purchased by one of these endowment funds that I mentioned before at a reasonable price so that the cultural identity of minority areas is not altered. Another way is to retake control of vital sectors such as the healthcare, education, and banking. This requires investments in these sectors, obviously, to make sure that their ownership is mostly by Christians or religious minority groups. A pilot of this concept is already underway in Erbil. We've seen the Catholic University, the Mariamana Hospital. These are small projects, but they are very indicative. And here I'd like to praise the vision of Bishop Bashar Warda, who was promoting these two projects. I think this is a great start. And if this pilot experience is managed properly, and if it receives the necessary resources, it can be used to further expand and enhance the role of the Christians in the sectors of higher education and the healthcare sector specifically. A strategic investment in similar projects, including channeling capital into banking institutions, for example, would enhance and empower the Christians and instill some balance in the power dynamics, which can later on give some advantage to the Christians if they want to have national discussions or national dialogue with other groups. So the battle of demographics may not be won, possibly, but there are other ways to sustain the presence of religious groups in Iraq. Control of money and knowledge is crucial for more influence. And we've seen, the best example is the United States. We've seen how much leverage the United States has because they control the flow of money and they control the knowledge in the world. So just to conclude, I'm sorry I went a bit over time. International standards list the following 4 areas to protect minorities in general: protection of existence, protection, promotion of identity, equality, non-discrimination, and the right to effective participation. Obviously, the 4 apply to Iraq. I have a caveat, as I said before, about equality. I think it has to be equity, not equality. But in order to achieve this over-ambitious objective, it is necessary, as I said before, first to understand the historic context. Second, to acknowledge that the problem is both political and social, not only political. And then to look into solutions around the following areas: constitutional guarantees, power sharing, non-territorial autonomy, local governance that is effective, transparent, and inclusive, social change among minority groups, social mobility, and leveraging the minorities' own resources and influence. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abouaoun, for your remarks. They resonated quite a bit just listening to them, and particularly refreshing is the fact that not only you stated the problem, which we often hear in such presentations, but you also, of course, laid out a plan to address the problems. So thank you for that. Rewinding back to the earlier part of your comments, one thing that particularly stuck out for me as an organization in defense of Christians, and we primarily are looking at Christian communities, of course, your comments regarding the need for such societies, for such government authorities and various parts of society to look at these communities as communities with their own unique identities, recognizing them and acknowledging them as sub-nations, if you will, and giving credit to their own organic identities rather than lumping them in and homogenizing them as a part of Iraqi society or even Syrian society or any other context in the Middle East. Found that fascinating and very refreshing as well, because very rarely in this world, academia and extending out to the think tanks, will you hear too sharply of a criticism of the Western Westphalian concept of nationhood and statehood. So that was particularly refreshing. Question on that would be, how is that brought into, and apart from the fascinating and important suggestions you make later in your argument, how could that be brought into the conversation and brought to fruition in Iraq and other places in the Middle East? I mean, and we see greater conversations to some extent taking traction in Lebanon when we're talking about federalism, for example, and Geneva talks when we're looking at Syria. Not sure if that's exactly the flavor you're thinking or discussing in the Iraqi context, but what are some thoughts you have there with regard to Iraq in acknowledging these indigenous and unique sub-national identities?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I guess the discussion is ongoing in Iraq. I don't think that we need to think about ways to trigger this discussion. I've seen, both in the public space and the private space, that there is some sort of an acceptance that there are subnational identities that we need to take into account. And the current constitution in Iraq takes into account this aspect. Now, I think there is an issue with how these constitutional guarantees are being practiced or approached in Iraq. But I don't see, from a political perspective, I don't see that there is a major problem at that level in Iraq. I think the problem in Iraq is mostly social. I think there is there's no, this diversity is not accepted by all groups at the social level. And when it comes to the political level, there is an issue with how these constitutional guarantees are actually implemented and enforced.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Dr. Abouaoun. I also wanted to encourage our audience to submit any questions through the Q&A function that you may have. But I wanted to follow up on your comment regarding demographic decline being irreversible, as you put it. And it appears, the emigration to Europe and North America, is there anything that can be done from the United States or those governments to reverse that emigration? While it'd certainly be valuable for assets to be held by wealthy members of the community abroad, like you had suggested, certainly bringing people coming back and bringing that wealth to invest in Iraq would also potentially foster a recovery in those communities. So I was wondering if you could weigh in on your thoughts on the barriers to re-emigration.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't think that re-immigration is feasible. As I said, you cannot uproot a family who left Iraq 20 or 30 years ago and tell them, okay, now you have to go back to Hamdaniya and to have to buy property again and establish your life over there. It's very difficult. However, if this family is well established in Michigan or any other state in the United States, you can encourage them to invest in Iraq. You can encourage them to support those who are remaining in Iraq. So there are several ways of leveraging the potential of the diaspora to support those who remain in Iraq. But there are many reasons why the demographic battle cannot be won in the case of Iraq. I mean, there's a cultural element here. You can't have Christian families plan for 10 or 12 kids. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, right? And as long as other majority groups have, this kind of paradigm in their family planning, then, you see why the demographic battle cannot be won. So, again, if you look at the suggestions that I made, including the one about social mobility, and economic empowerment by investing in the right sectors, then probably the flow of immigration from Iraq will slow down. So over time, you can stabilize potentially the number of Christians in Iraq. But I don't think you can reverse it by bringing people from the places they immigrated to back into Iraq. I think this is a bit an overreach.
Understood. I wanted to ask you a question about the conflict and stabilization monitoring framework, which you mentioned during your talk. This is really incredible data that the U.S. Institute of Peace collects. Is there anything that you think could be done to enhance the collection that the U.S. Institute of Peace currently does, or other ways that this information could be better utilized by the U.S. government in our engagement with Iraq?
Well, I mean, there are two challenges that are related to this project. The first one is the availability of resources. So the team working on this project was not always able to secure the necessary resources to maintain the right frequency to collect data and provide analysis. And the second one is the dissemination and the mainstreaming of the findings with policymakers. And I think IDC can help specifically with this aspect, not to the resources one. So yes, I encourage you to get in touch with the team working on this project and see how the findings coming out from this data collection can be used in your own policy work and advocacy and networking in DC with policymakers.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience?
It seems the audience is enjoying lunch while watching. So I hope they're enjoying both the talk as well as their lunch simultaneously. Well, thank you, Dr. Abouaoun, for your joining us today and for your very interesting remarks. And as William and you had just discussed a moment ago, data-based and fact-based policy is really how you can find the greatest means to target the objective. So we certainly look forward to looking into that and incorporating that into our work on policy. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you, and we look forward to remaining in touch. But before adjourning here, I just want to throw out a quick word for our second Learn at Lunch seminar, which will be, and correct me on the date, William, it's going to be the 28th of April. It's going to be in cooperation and in conjunction with our friends at the Armenian National Committee of America, particularly Representative Robert Abedizian from the Republic of Artsakh, also known as Nagorno-Karabakh. He'll be discussing with us the issues and the challenges faced by Armenian Christians in Artsakh over the last 3.5, almost 4 months, as a direct result, of course, of Azerbaijan's blockade on the Armenian homeland. So we look forward to that discussion. But until then, we will get information out in terms of registration, make that available for all who wish to attend. And that will be held in person, I should also mention, here in DC, location to be announced very soon. So once again, thank you, Dr. Abouaoun, for joining us.
Thank you.
And we wish you a great afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you.